The boy was maybe 4 years old, standing at her side in the crowded terminal, both hands wrapped around the handle of a rolling suitcase too large for him. Ethan Calder saw the woman first, the way you see something that was once yours. Then the boy turned. On his small wrist, impossibly, was a watch. Ethan's hand went cold. He had buried that watch 11 years ago. So why was a stranger's child wearing it? Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. Ethan Calder did not wait in lines. He did not carry his own bags. He did not walk through public terminals. He had a private entrance, a private lounge, a private everything, because when you controlled more wealth than most countries would ever see, the world made room for you automatically. He had just closed the largest infrastructure deal in East Asian history. 47 hours without sleep. His legal team was still celebrating somewhere behind him. He felt nothing except the specific, quiet exhaustion of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. That was the last thought he had before he saw her. She was moving through the main terminal, on the other side of the glass partition that separated his world from everyone else's. She had her head down, pulling a carry-on, a dark coat, her hair shorter than he remembered. But he knew the way she walked. He had spent 2 years memorizing it without meaning to, and 11 years trying to forget. Nora Vance. His security team read his stillness and moved. 2 men stepped forward automatically, reading his body language the way they always did. Something has changed, respond. Stop. His voice came out quiet. Certain. They stopped. They didn't ask questions. They never did. He stood at the glass and watched her move through the crowd, and he told himself it wasn't her. He told himself that 11 years changes a person, that distance creates similarity where there isn't any, that his mind was searching for something familiar after too many sleepless hours. He told himself all of it. Then she slowed, and a small boy appeared at her side. He had been slightly ahead of her, apparently fascinated by the rolling luggage carts near the far wall. Now he came back, found her hand, and held it with the easy certainty of a child who has never once worried about being found. He was 4 years old, maybe just past it. Dark hair. Serious expression. A face that was still in the process of becoming whatever it was going to be. The boy turned, the way children do in crowds, just looking, just curious, and his gaze landed directly on Ethan. Something moved through the air between them. It had no name. Ethan refused to give it one. He looked away first. That was unusual. Ethan Calder had not looked away from anything in years. He looked back. The boy had already turned, tugging Nora's sleeve, pointing at something on the ceiling, a departures board, a light, the ordinary magic of airports that children never get tired of. Nora looked up at whatever he was pointing at and smiled. A real one. The kind people only have when they think nobody's watching them. Ethan's chest tightened in a way he couldn't categorize. Then the boy shifted, and Ethan saw his wrist. The watch was too large for him. It sat loose on his small arm, turning slightly to the side with every movement. Old. Elegant. A brown leather strap darkened with age. And even from this distance, through the glass, Ethan recognized the shape of the case the way you recognize your own name written in someone else's handwriting. 1962 Patek Philippe. His father's. Ethan knew every millimeter of that watch. He had studied it as a child, sitting in his father's office on Saturdays when Harold Calder would let him spin in the big chair and ask questions about business that he was too young to understand. He knew the particular gold of the case. He knew the engraving on the back, HJC, his father's initials, scratched in by a jeweler in Geneva before Ethan was born. He had placed that watch in the casket himself. He remembered the weight of it in his palm. He remembered his mother reaching for his hand immediately after, as if she'd been waiting for him to let go of it. He had watched them close the lid. He had watched them lower it into the ground. So the watch on this boy's wrist was impossible. That was the only word for it. Not unlikely. Not strange. Impossible. Ethan's hand moved to his own wrist without thinking. He felt the watch he wore every day, the replacement he had commissioned 2 years after his father died because he missed having something there. He had never told anyone why he wore it. On the other side of the glass, Nora finally looked up. She saw him. For 1/2 second, her face held the expression of a person who has walked into a room and found something exactly where they expected to find it. Not surprise. Not fear. Recognition. And beneath it, something older. Something that looked almost like a rival. She should have looked away. That was what you did when 11 years sat between you and someone. You looked away. You moved faster. You found a different exit. Nora Vance did none of those things. She said something to the boy, short, quiet, the sound muted by the glass, and he nodded and took hold of her hand again without looking up. Then she changed direction. Slowly. Deliberately. She walked toward Ethan. The boy walked with her, still holding the rolling suitcase that was nearly half his height, completely unbothered, watching his own feet with the concentration of a child who has made stepping on the right floor tiles into a private game. Ethan's security stepped forward again. He stopped them again. He didn't know why he kept doing that. His mind was still somewhere behind the glass, still standing over a casket, still watching an impossible watch catch the afternoon light on a 4-year-old's wrist. The door between the terminal sections opened. An attendant held it without being asked. People always held things for Ethan Calder without being asked. Nora walked through. The boy walked through beside her. Up close, she looked like herself. That was the most unsettling part. Not older in a way that distance created. Just herself. Like the 11 years had happened around her instead of to her. She stopped 2 feet away from him. She looked at his face. He looked at hers. Neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. The boy had found a new game. He was carefully, precisely, walking only on the dark tiles, skipping the light ones. Nora glanced at the watch on the boy's wrist, just briefly, just once, and then she looked back at Ethan. And she said 4 words. We need to talk. Not I can explain. Not I'm sorry. Not the beginning of an apology or a defense or any of the things that 11 years of silence should have built up into. Just that. Calm. Certain. Like she had rehearsed this moment. Like she had been waiting for exactly this airport, this corridor, this version of him, and she was not afraid of any of it. The boy stepped over a light tile and landed on a dark one and looked up at Ethan for just a second, checking if anyone had noticed how good he was at this game. Ethan looked at the watch on his wrist. He had no answer for any of it. Not one. If you felt that, the weight of that watch, the silence between 2 people who have 11 years of questions between them, drop a comment below and let us know what you think is really going on. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here when the truth starts coming out. This story is only getting started. The private lounge was quiet in the way that expensive places always are, every surface designed to absorb sound, to absorb discomfort, to make whatever was happening feel manageable. Nothing about this felt manageable. Ethan sat across from Nora Vance for the first time in 11 years, and the first thing he noticed was that she wasn't nervous. That was wrong. That was the thing his mind kept returning to while his security waited outside, and the boy, Luca, she'd said his name was Luca, sat in the corner of the room with a small tablet, headphones on, completely absorbed in whatever 4-year-olds watched at 10 in the morning. Ethan had questions. He had 11 years of questions lined up behind his teeth. He opened his mouth to ask the most important one. Nora spoke first. Where did you get the watch you're wearing? He stopped. What? She nodded toward his wrist. The one you have on now. Where did it come from? He looked down at it. The replacement. The one he'd had made 2 years after his father's funeral because the absence of weight on his wrist had started to feel like an open wound. I had it made, he said slowly. After my father died. She nodded, like that confirmed something she already suspected. Then she folded her hands on the table and looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not guilt. Not apology. Something that had been carried a long time and set down very carefully. He leaned forward. Nora. The boy's watch. I know what it is. Then you know it's impossible. I know what I was told about it. She paused. That's not the same thing. He held on to his patience. It was getting harder. 3 days before our wedding, he said. You were gone. Your apartment was empty. You left nothing. For the first time, something crossed her face that wasn't calm. It was brief, a single second where the composure thinned, and then it was gone. I know, she said quietly. My investigators couldn't find you. I hired 4 separate firms over 2 years. Nothing. He heard his own voice and didn't entirely recognize it. Too flat. Too controlled. The voice of someone who had spent a long time deciding how he would sound if he ever said these words out loud. I looked for you, Nora. She didn't say she was sorry. He was almost grateful for that. An apology would have made him angrier. Do you remember the week before? He asked. Do you remember everything that happened that week? Yes. My mother came to see you. Something shifted in her eyes. Yes. I didn't know about that until 6 months after you were gone. Someone on my assistant staff mentioned it. I never told you I knew. He watched her face. I never asked her about it either. I don't know why. I think part of me didn't want the answer. That was the truth he had never said out loud to anyone. In the years after Nora disappeared, he had rebuilt himself into something hard and large and permanently in motion, and he had let that one unanswered question sit in a room he never opened. His mother had met with Nora. Then Nora was gone. He had refused to connect those 2 things because connecting them meant something about his mother that he wasn't willing to look at. Nora was looking at him with something that might have been sadness. She didn't threaten me, she said carefully. I want you to know that. Then what did she do? She asked me to make a choice. Nora paused. And she gave me information that made the choice feel like it wasn't really a choice at all. What information? That's what I came to show you. She reached into her bag. Across the room, Luca pulled one headphone off his ear. Mama, he said, not looking up from the tablet. Can I have the crackers? She pulled a small bag from a side pocket without looking and held it out. He came and took it and went back to his corner, already absorbed again before he sat down. Ethan watched him go. He had spent 11 years building a company that employed 400,000 people. He had negotiated with heads of state. He had sat across from people who genuinely frightened him and never looked away. He was looking at a 4-year-old boy in the corner of a room eating crackers, and something in his chest was doing something he didn't have a category for. He looked back at Nora. She had placed an envelope on the table between them. It was old. Not ancient, but worn, the kind of worn that came from being handled repeatedly, picked up and put back down, moved from one place to another over years. The paper had gone soft at the corners. It had never been opened. The flap was still sealed. On the front, in handwriting he would have known anywhere, was his name. Not Nora's name. His. Ethan. His mother's handwriting. He had grown up reading report cards she'd annotated, birthday cards she'd written, notes left on the kitchen counter of the house he grew up in. He knew every loop of it. She gave this to me the day we met, Nora said. She told me not to open it. She told me to keep it, and that I would know when the time was right to bring it to you. She paused. She told me the year. She told me to come back this year specifically. Ethan stared at the envelope. She planned this, he said. It wasn't a question. She planned something, Nora said. I'm not sure I understand all of what. She's been paying for your life for 11 years. Nora went very still. How do you know that? I had someone make a call on the way here. He kept his voice even. A private trust. Her personal accounts, not my company. Every month for 11 years. The calm on Nora's face finally cracked, not into guilt, but into something more complicated. Something that looked like a person realizing they had never fully understood the thing they were standing inside of. I thought, she stopped. She told me the arrangement was from your father's estate. My father has been dead for 15 years. Nora looked down at the envelope between them. Across the room, Luca had finished the crackers. He folded the empty bag into a small square with tremendous concentration, the way children do when they decide something is important. Then he looked up at Ethan with the direct, uncomplicated curiosity that only very young children still have, the kind that hasn't yet learned to be polite about staring. Ethan looked back at him. The watch caught the light on the boy's wrist. He made himself look away. He made himself look at Nora. You said you didn't come to explain. You said you had no choice. That's true. Then tell me one thing. He kept his voice steady. It cost him something. Did you want to come back? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at him the way someone looks at a question that deserves more than a quick answer. I came, she said finally, because she told me if I didn't, something would happen that couldn't be undone. And because, she stopped herself. That's not a conversation for right now. Then what is? She pushed the envelope forward until it was directly in front of him. He looked at his name in his mother's handwriting. 11 years old. Sealed. Waiting for exactly this moment. She knew I would be here, he said. She knew where you'd find me. Yes. She set this up. I think she's been setting it up for a very long time. He picked up the envelope. Felt the weight of it. Set it back down. His mother had sat across from Nora Vance 11 years ago, the week before the wedding, and she had given his fiancée a sealed letter addressed to him and sent her away. And for 11 years, his mother had called him every Sunday morning without fail, had come to his birthday, had attended his board dinners, had asked him if he was happy, and had never said a single word. He looked at the envelope. He didn't know yet what his mother had done. But he was beginning to understand the shape of it. And the shape was large enough to change everything he thought he knew about the last 11 years of his life. If you're feeling what Ethan is feeling right now, that slow, cold realization that someone you trusted had answers the whole time, tell us in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here when that envelope finally opens. Ethan had held the envelope for 3 full minutes without opening it. That was not like him. Ethan Calder made decisions fast. It was one of the first things people said about him in business profiles, in interviews, in the quiet conversations that happened about him in boardrooms he wasn't in. He processed, he decided, he moved. He had built a $1 trillion empire on the back of that reflex. He could not make himself open this envelope. Nora sat across from him and didn't push. That was either patience or strategy, and he wasn't sure yet which one she was capable of. He slid his thumb under the flap and opened it. Inside were three things: a letter, a photograph, and a second envelope, smaller, sealed, with a name written on the front in the same handwriting. Luca. Ethan looked at that for a moment. A sealed envelope addressed to a 4-year-old boy by name. Written 11 years ago. By his mother. He set it aside and picked up the letter. 2 pages. Except they weren't 2 complete pages, they were the middle portion of something longer. The top of the first page began mid-sentence, and the bottom of the second page ended without conclusion. Whatever had come before and after had been removed deliberately. What remained had been left for a reason. He read it twice. The language was careful in the way that legal language is careful, not warm, not cold, just precise. It instructed Nora to keep the contents of the envelope private. It told her to return to find Ethan in this specific year, not a month earlier, not a month later. It referenced, without explaining, something called an agreement honored. And it closed with a single line that sat at the bottom of the second page like a period at the end of a sentence that should have been much longer. When the time comes, he will need to understand. Let him open it himself. Ethan set the letter down. His mother was 72 years old. She still went to her office 3 days a week to run the Calder Family Foundation, the charitable organization she had built in his father's name after Harold Calder died. She called Ethan every Sunday morning at 9. She remembered the names of his staff members' children. She sent handwritten cards for birthdays. She had also written these instructions 11 years ago, placed them in Nora's hands, and then sat across from him at every Sunday phone call, every holiday dinner, every board event, and said nothing. He picked up the photograph. 3 people. His mother in the center, younger by at least 15 years but unmistakably her, the same posture, the same careful stillness she always had in photographs, like she was deciding how much to give away. On her left, a man Ethan didn't recognize. 40, maybe 45, in a dark suit, standing slightly apart from the other two in the way that professional men stand when they want to signal they're present but not involved. On her right, visible through a glass wall in the background, was the unmistakable interior of a law office, shelves of bound files, a conference table, the particular tidiness of a place that dealt with serious things. In the bottom right corner, a date stamp. 1 week before Nora disappeared. Ethan studied the man he didn't recognize. He had the instinct, the way you sometimes do with faces, that he had seen this person before, not recently, not clearly, but somewhere in the outer edges of his memory where things lived that you'd never thought to examine. He couldn't place him. He set the photograph face down on the table and looked at the second envelope. Luca. 4 letters. His mother's hand. Across the room, the boy himself was lying on his stomach on the floor now, tablet abandoned, drawing something on a small notepad that Nora had apparently materialized from her bag at some point. His tongue was slightly out. He was concentrating very hard. Ethan watched him for a moment. Then he made a decision that surprised even himself. Hey! He kept his voice easy. Conversational. Luca. The boy looked up. What are you drawing? Luca held up the notepad. It was a house. Or possibly a car. The distinction wasn't entirely clear. It's got a big garden, Luca said seriously, pointing to a green scribble at the bottom. Does it have a name? The house? Luca considered this. Cedar Hill, he said. Then he looked back down at his drawing, already done with the conversation, already moving on the way children do. The room went very quiet. Ethan didn't move. Cedar Hill was not a name anyone invented casually. It was not a common phrase, not a street name, not a place you'd find on a map. It was what his father had called the private estate where Ethan had spent every summer of his childhood, a property that had never been publicly named, never listed in any interview or profile, that existed only in the private language of the Calder family. His mother still used the name. His cousins used it. No one else. No one else should know it. He looked at Nora. She was watching him with an expression that said she had known this moment was coming and had been dreading it anyway. He stood up. I need a minute. The corridor outside the lounge was empty and climate-controlled and completely silent. He stood with his back against the wall and looked at his phone for a moment. Then he called his mother. She answered on the second ring. Ethan. Her voice was exactly as it always was. Steady. Warm. His mother's voice. He opened his mouth to start with a question, a careful one, a constructed one, the kind he used in negotiations when he didn't want to show how much he already knew. Instead he just said, I'm at the airport. A pause. Very brief. I know, she said. The 2 words landed differently than anything else she could have said. Not what do you mean, not which airport, not is everything all right. Just, I know. Clear. Immediate. Like she'd been sitting beside a phone that had been waiting for exactly this call. "You know," he repeated. "Ethan. How do you know?" She didn't answer that. What she said instead was, "Don't open the second envelope yet." Her voice had changed, still controlled, but underneath it, something he almost never heard from her. Something that sounded like fear wearing the mask of calm. "Please. Not yet. I'm asking you as your mother." He looked down the corridor at the closed door of the private lounge. Behind it, a woman who had kept his mother's secret for 11 years. A boy who knew the name of a place he had no way of knowing. An envelope addressed to that boy in handwriting that was 15 years old. "Mom." He kept his voice quiet. "Who told you I'd seen her?" Silence. Not the silence of someone thinking. The silence of someone deciding how much longer they could keep a door closed before it came off the hinges on its own. Someone told Sylvia Calder that Ethan had found Nora, and she won't say who. If you're already putting the pieces together, share your theory in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's inside that second envelope. Ethan didn't wait until morning. He made the call from the corridor outside the lounge before the door had fully closed behind him. His most trusted financial investigator picked up on the first ring. The man always did, because Ethan paid him enough to sleep with his phone. "I need a forensic trace on a private trust," Ethan said. "Established in Geneva, approximately 11 years ago. Beneficiary name is Nora Vance. Find me everything, source of funds, authorization signatures, payment history. Everything. Timeline? An hour." He hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at nothing. Then he went back inside. The call came back in 53 minutes. Ethan was sitting apart from Nora, watching Luca build something out of sugar packets he'd collected from the refreshment counter, when his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Stepped away. He listened for 4 minutes without speaking. The trust had been established 11 years ago, 3 weeks after Nora disappeared. It was not connected to his company. It was not connected to any business account he had ever touched. It was funded entirely from private holdings registered under one name. Sylvia Calder. His mother had been paying for Nora's life, her apartment, her groceries, Luca's school fees, Luca's doctor visits, every single month, without missing one, for over a decade. Not from wealth that passed through Ethan. From her own. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Nora. She was watching him with the expression of someone who already knows the verdict. "You knew it was her," he said quietly. "She told me it came from your father's estate. My father's estate was settled 12 years ago. There's nothing left in it that moves." He paused. "She's been funding this herself. For 11 years. Nora went still. And in that stillness, something changed in her face, not guilt, but something closer to the ground. The particular expression of someone who has just discovered that the story they were told, the story they built their life around, had a version they were never shown. "I didn't know that," she said. And he believed her. He drove to his mother's house that evening. Sylvia Calder lived in the same house she had raised him in, not because she couldn't afford something larger, but because she believed that people who moved away from their history were usually running from it. She had said that to Ethan once when he was 17, and he had never forgotten it. She opened the door before he knocked. She had known he was coming. The living room was the same as it had always been. Same chairs. Same photographs on the mantel. His father's face in a silver frame on the far wall, looking out at the room with the quiet authority of a man who had been dead for 15 years and still somehow set the tone. Ethan sat down. He didn't take his coat off. "I know about the trust," he said. His mother sat across from him. She folded her hands. She didn't flinch. "I know you do. 11 years, Mom." "Yes. You paid for her apartment. For the boys' school. His medical bills." "Yes." He leaned forward. "She was going to be my wife. You met with her 1 week before the wedding, and 4 days later she was gone. And you have been paying for her life, his life, every month since." He stopped. "And you never said one word." Sylvia looked at him steadily. "I was protecting you." The words landed wrong. Not because they were cold, they weren't. They were said the way she said everything, with complete, settled certainty, like a woman who had made peace with a decision long ago and was no longer interested in defending it, only in standing behind it. "From what?" he said. "What were you protecting me from?" She looked at him for a long moment. And then she said nothing. That silence was its own kind of answer. The kind that told him the truth was larger than she was willing to hand him all at once. He went back to where Nora and Luca were staying that night, a guest suite at one of his properties, because there was nowhere else that made sense, and he was past pretending any part of this was normal. Nora was standing at the window when he came in. Luca was supposed to be asleep in the next room. The apartment was quiet. She won't tell me what she was protecting me from, he said. Nora turned. She told me the same thing, 11 years ago. That there were people who would use Luca if they knew about him. That keeping him hidden was the only way to keep him safe. She paused. I didn't fully understand what she meant. But I was scared enough not to ask. Scared of her? No. She said it simply, without decoration. Not of her. Of whatever she was afraid of. Because Sylvia Calder doesn't frighten easily. And she was frightened. Ethan stood with that for a moment. Then the door to the small bedroom opened, and Luca appeared in the doorway in his pajamas, holding a stuffed bear that had clearly been through considerable hardship. He blinked at Ethan with the calm, unhurried curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed about showing up places. He walked into the room. He looked down at the watch on his wrist the way children look at things they've forgotten they're wearing. Then he looked up at Ethan. Then he looked at Nora. Is this the man Papa told me about? The room stopped. Ethan didn't move. He didn't breathe. Nora's face held for exactly 1 second, a single second where the composure she'd maintained across 2 days and 1,000 difficult questions simply broke open, and then she pulled it back. Smoothed it down. Reached for something steady. Come here, baby, she said. Her voice only slightly changed. Luca went to her without urgency. He leaned against her side and looked at Ethan with a 4-year-old's complete, unself-conscious attention. We should talk tomorrow, Nora said. She wasn't looking at Ethan when she said it. She was looking at her son. Ethan looked at the boy. Papa told me about him. Someone had told this child about Ethan. By name, or by description, or by something specific enough that Luca recognized it now, in this room, without being prompted. Which meant someone else in this story knew exactly who Ethan was and exactly what this moment would look like. And in 4 days, across 2 countries, through his mother's silence and Nora's careful answers and a sealed envelope addressed to a 4-year-old, not one person had mentioned that someone. Not once. If that last line just stopped your heart a little, you're exactly where this story wants you. Drop your theory in the comments. Who do you think Papa really is? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here when the name finally gets said out loud. The next morning, Luca was eating toast at the kitchen table when Nora finally told Ethan the truth. Or what she believed was the truth. She sat across from him with both hands around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking from, and she talked the way people talk when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time, carefully, like they're afraid the words will hurt worse out loud than they did inside. After I left, she said, I went to Geneva. Like Sylvia arranged. I didn't know anyone. I had the apartment, the monthly transfers, and a phone number I was told to call only in an emergency. She paused. I was alone for about 2 years. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. I met Daniel at a small gallery opening. He was quiet. Careful. He'd worked in diplomacy for years. He said he was semi-retired. She looked at her cup. He didn't ask too many questions about my past. At the time I thought that was kindness. How long were you together? 6 years. He moved in after the first year. Luca was born 2 years after that. She looked over at the boy, who was methodically pulling the crust off his toast and lining the pieces up along the edge of his plate. He was a good father. Patient. He used to sit with Luca for an hour after dinner and just let him talk about whatever he wanted. Dinosaurs, mostly. A small sound, almost a laugh, but not quite. Luca talked about dinosaurs constantly. Ethan looked at the boy arranging his crusts. Something in his chest moved in a direction he didn't have a name for. What happened to him? Nora's voice went flat. The particular flatness of someone who has told a painful story enough times that they've learned to get through it by removing all the texture. Heart failure. 14 months ago. He was 51 years old and he went to sleep on a Tuesday night and he didn't wake up. She stopped. Luca was 3. He kept going to Daniel's side of the bed for 2 weeks after. The room was quiet. Across the table, Luca set the last piece of crust in its place, studied the arrangement, and seemed satisfied. Ethan looked at Nora. She was staring at the table. She had loved Daniel Marsh, or something real enough that the loss of him still sat in the room with her everywhere she went. He could see it. And that, more than anything, was what made it hurt. She hadn't come back for Ethan. She had come back because a life she'd built without him had fallen apart, and the trust was expiring, and Sylvia's letter had arrived with an instruction and a deadline, and she had nowhere else to go. He understood that. He even believed it. It was a complete, human, sad story, and it had no room in it for him. The watch, he said finally. She nodded like she'd been waiting for that. Daniel found it at an estate auction, maybe 5 years ago. He loved old watches. He had a collection. He'd buy them, research their histories, sometimes sell them on. This one he kept. She glanced toward Luca's wrist. When he died, Luca found it on the nightstand. He put it on and refused to take it off. I didn't fight him on it. It was the one thing that still smelled like Daniel, I think. Ethan looked at the watch. I didn't know it had belonged to your father, she said. Not until I saw your face at the airport. He nodded slowly. He thought about his father placing that watch in the casket. He thought about himself standing at the edge of a grave at 23 years old, watching the lid close. And then he thought about an estate auction. A diplomat in Geneva with a taste for old things. A small boy who refused to let go. It was sad. It was all just sad. He offered her what he could, access to his legal team, help extending the trust arrangement, whatever Luca needed for school. She thanked him with the distant, careful gratitude of someone who hasn't decided yet how much to let another person in. That afternoon, Ethan went back to his own house for the first time in 3 days. He sat in his office. He looked at the city through the glass. He thought about Nora building a life in Geneva without him, a real life, with a table they ate at together and a man who sat with a small boy and talked about dinosaurs, and he tried to figure out what he was supposed to do with that. He didn't come up with an answer. His phone rang at 11 that night. It was his archivist, a meticulous, quiet man named Graham who had spent 15 years cataloging the Calder family's private records and who was not, as a rule, given to drama. I need to tell you something about the watch, Graham said. Ethan straightened. Go ahead. You asked me to pull your father's estate documentation. I've been through all of it. A pause. The 1962 Patek Philippe, the one engraved HJC, it was listed on the interment inventory. It was buried with your father. I have the funeral home records, the estate sign-off, and a notarized inventory list that includes it by serial number. Ethan went very still. I also ran a search on every major auction record in Europe going back 20 years, Graham continued. Private sales, estate liquidations, all of it. That serial number has never appeared at auction. Not once. The silence stretched. Graham. Ethan kept his voice even. Are you certain? I've checked it 4 times. He hung up. He sat there in the dark of his office and looked at nothing. The watch had been buried. He knew that. He had held it in his palm and placed it in the casket himself. But Nora had believed Daniel bought it at auction. He could see that she believed it. There was nothing in her face that had been performing. She had told him the story the way you tell a story that belongs to you. Which meant one of 2 things. Either Daniel Marsh had lied to her about where it came from. Or Daniel Marsh was not who Nora had believed he was for 6 years. And if either of those things was true, if the man she had built her life around in Geneva had been something other than a quiet, careful, retired diplomat who loved old watches and sat with small boys talking about dinosaurs, then nothing about the last 11 years was as simple as it had looked an hour ago. If that watch just changed everything you thought you understood about this story, you're not alone. Share your theory in the comments, because something tells us Daniel Marsh is about to become the most important person in this story. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here when the truth about him comes out. Ethan gave his investigators until morning. They needed 4 hours. Daniel Marsh, former diplomat, quiet and careful, the man who had raised Luca and slept beside Nora for 6 years, did not exist before 15 years ago. No birth certificate. No school records. No childhood address. No family. Nothing before a single passport application filed in Zurich, with supporting documents that his investigators described, in the careful language of people who deal in facts, as professionally constructed. Not forged by an amateur. Constructed by someone who knew exactly how identity systems worked and exactly how to fill every gap that a routine check would look for. Ethan sat with that for a long moment. Then he asked the next question. Do we have a photograph of him? We pulled one from the files Nora gave us. Running it now. He told them to compare it against every archive they had access to. His father's company records. Board documents. Contractor files. Everything going back 30 years. He told them to call him the moment they had something. The call came at 6 in the morning. One match. A board document from 23 years ago, internal, never published, filed during a period when Harold Calder was expanding the company into new markets. The document listed several external consultants brought in for a single quarter. One of them had no last name on record. Just a first initial and a role, strategic advisory. And in the corner of a group photograph taken at a board dinner that same year, barely visible, standing slightly apart from the main group the way people stand when they want to be present but not remembered, was the face. Younger. But the same. The man Nora had known as Daniel Marsh had been inside Harold Calder's company 23 years ago. For years before Ethan was even old enough to join the board. 8 years before Nora had ever left the country. Ethan looked at the photograph on his phone screen for a long time. Then he went to find Nora. She was in the kitchen when he came in. Luca was still asleep. The apartment was quiet in the early morning way that feels like borrowed time. He put his phone on the counter between them, photograph facing up. She looked at it. He watched her face. It didn't go defensive. It didn't close. It did something worse, it simply fell apart, slowly, the way a structure falls when the thing holding it together is suddenly gone. She picked up the phone. She looked at the photograph for a long time. "That's him," she said quietly. "That's Daniel. That photograph was taken 23 years ago. Inside my father's company." She set the phone down. She didn't speak. "Daniel Marsh doesn't exist before 15 years ago," Ethan said. "No birth records. No history. His entire identity was built from scratch by someone who knew what they were doing." She sat down at the kitchen table. She put both hands flat on the surface like she needed something solid. He wasn't angry at her. He could see, clearly, completely, that she was not performing shock. She had loved a man for 6 years. She had watched him be a father. She had sat beside him at dinner tables and talked about ordinary things, and she had believed, the way you believe in things you have no reason to question, that he was exactly who he said he was. And none of it had been real. "He knew about you," she said finally. Her voice was very quiet. "He knew your name from the beginning. I thought it was because I'd told him. But now I'm thinking," she stopped. "He already knew." She nodded. "Once." Like the movement cost her something. Across the apartment, Luca's door was still closed. Behind it, a 4-year-old boy was sleeping, wearing a watch that couldn't have come from an auction, dreaming whatever 4-year-olds dream, and his father, the only father he had ever known, had been a man with a manufactured name and a history that stretched directly into the Calder family's past. Ethan looked at the closed door. He had no framework for what he was feeling. He put it away and focused on what was in front of him. Sylvia had been calling since yesterday. 3 missed calls, no voicemails. The 4th call came while Ethan was standing in the corridor outside the kitchen, and he sent it to voicemail for the first time in his adult life. 30 seconds later, a text: "The envelope addressed to Luca must not be opened without me present. Please, Ethan." Wait. He stared at the message. His mother had known Daniel Marsh was inside the company 23 years ago. She had to have known. She had been at those board dinners, she had reviewed those consultant lists, she had run the foundation in Harold Calder's name for 15 years. If this man's face appeared in a photograph from that period, Sylvia had been in the same room. And she was calling now, urgently, specifically about the envelope addressed to a 4-year-old boy. He went back inside. Nora was still at the table. She had her arms crossed over her chest, not defensively, just the way a person holds themselves when they're cold from the inside. "Where is the second envelope?" he asked. She looked toward the hallway. "In my bag. In the guest room." He nodded. He didn't move toward it. He stood there, thinking. Then Luca's door opened. The boy came out in his pajamas, hair still flattened from sleep, carrying something in both hands with the careful, important posture of a child who has been trusted with something fragile. He walked directly to Ethan. He held out the envelope. It was the second one, the sealed one, addressed to Luca in Sylvia's handwriting. He had found it in Nora's bag. He couldn't read his own name on the front, but he had known, the way children sometimes know things without being able to explain why, that it mattered. "Mama cries when she looks at this," Luca said. Simply. Factually. The way children report the world. Ethan took it. He held it in both hands. He looked at his mother's handwriting. He looked at the boy who had carried it to him without knowing what it was, only that it was important. He should wait. He knew he should wait. He lifted the flap, just slightly, just enough, not to read it, just to see. One line. The top of a document, visible through the fold. His father's company name. The full legal name, the one used only in formal agreements, the one that hadn't appeared in active paperwork since Harold Calder died. And beneath it, a date. 9 months before Ethan was born. He closed the envelope. He stood very still in the middle of the room, holding a letter that predated his own existence, written by his mother, addressed to a child whose identity he still didn't fully understand, and he realized, with the particular cold clarity of a man who built empires by seeing the shape of things before anyone else did, that whatever his father had done, he had done it before Ethan's life had even started. If you just felt the ground shift under this entire story, drop a comment below, because we're not at the bottom yet. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here when that envelope finally opens all the way. Ethan read the document 3 times before he said a single word. It wasn't long. 2 pages, formal language, dated in the year his father would have been 31 years old. A partnership agreement between Harold James Calder and one other party, a party whose name had been carefully, completely removed from every line where it appeared. Not crossed out. Removed. Whoever had prepared this copy had done it deliberately, leaving clean white space where a name should have been. But the structure of the agreement was still there. The terms. The obligations. And buried on the second page, in language so dry it almost hid what it actually said, a clause that made Ethan go very still. In the event of either partner's death, the clause read, the surviving partner's primary heir shall be bound to the shared inheritance structure herein described, with all rights and claims to be settled no later than the surviving heir's 40th year, unless the conditions outlined in Appendix C are satisfied in full prior to that date. Ethan turned 40 in 6 weeks. He set the document on the table. He looked at Nora across the room. She had been watching his face while he read, and she had learned enough about him in the past few days to know that the expression he was wearing right now, flat, careful, completely still, meant something large was happening underneath. Someone redacted a name from this, he said. I know. You haven't read it. I read it an hour ago, when you were in the other room. She paused. I don't know whose name is missing. But I know my father had a business partner before he died. My mother mentioned it once, when I was older. She said he had a falling out with someone and never talked about it again. She stopped. She said it was about money. It was always about money. Nora's father had died when she was 7 years old. Ethan looked at the date on the document again. This agreement was signed before his parents were even married. Before either of them existed. Sylvia arrived at his estate at 2 in the afternoon. He hadn't called her. He hadn't invited her. She simply appeared at the gate in the car she'd been driving for 15 years, and when his staff called to ask if they should let her through, he said yes before he'd fully decided what he was going to say to her. She walked in without rushing. She looked at Nora, who was sitting in the chair by the window, and something passed between the two women, not warmth, not hostility. Something older than either of those things. The look of two people who had been part of the same story for a long time without ever being in the same room. Sylvia sat down. She did not apologize. She did not perform remorse. She was afraid. That was the thing Ethan kept coming back to. His mother, who had never been afraid of anything in the entire 72 years of her life, was sitting in his living room with fear in her eyes. The name that's been removed, Ethan said. Tell me whose it is. She looked at Nora. Then she looked at her son. It's her father's, she said. Robert Vance. The room went quiet. Nora didn't move. Her face did something complicated, processing, rearranging, trying to find a place to put information that didn't fit anywhere she'd built. Your father and Robert Vance were partners, Sylvia said to Ethan. Before I ever met Harold. Before Robert met his wife. They built something together. It didn't survive, but the legal agreement they signed did, and it had that clause in it. The inheritance clause. I didn't find out about it until after your father died. And Nora's father was already dead by then, Ethan said. He died when she was 7. The surviving heir clause activated the moment Harold died. You became bound to it. She folded her hands. You had until your 40th birthday to settle it. Or it would activate automatically. Ethan stood up. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to the room for a moment, looking at nothing. Then he turned around. You arranged for us to meet. He said it quietly. Not as a question. 20 years ago. You arranged it. Sylvia didn't look away. I introduced you at the Hartley Foundation dinner. I made sure you were both there. I made sure you were seated near each other. A pause. I believed that if you loved each other, the inheritance negotiation would be simpler. That two people who wanted to be together would be more willing to find terms than two strangers in a lawyer's office. You built our relationship, Ethan said. From the start. I created an opportunity. What happened between you was real. Don't do that. His voice was still quiet. It was worse that way. Don't tell me what was real. He looked at Nora. She was looking back at him with the expression of someone who has just watched the most important thing in their life get picked up and turned over and shown to have a different shape on the other side. The dinner where they met. The way it had felt like accident, like luck, like the specific randomness of two people finding each other in a crowded room. Constructed. All of it, constructed. They looked at each other and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say that would make the silence between them smaller. Luca walked in from the hallway. He stopped in the middle of the room. He looked at his mother's face. He looked at Ethan's. He looked at Sylvia, who he had never met before, and then back at Nora. His forehead creased. Are you sad because of me? He asked Nora. She was across the room in 3 steps. She pulled him against her and held on, and she didn't answer, she couldn't, and Luca let himself be held with the patient, slightly confused tolerance of a child who doesn't fully understand what's happening but knows that sometimes adults need this more than he does. Ethan watched them. He looked at the watch on Luca's wrist. His father's watch. Worn by a boy who had been, until a few days ago, completely unknown to him. He looked at his mother. "There's more," he said. It wasn't a question. Sylvia straightened. She had been waiting for this. "There is one more condition in the original agreement. One I never told you about because I was completely certain, that it would never be relevant. Tell me now. It involves a child." She paused. "And it involves the watch." She looked at Luca, still held against Nora's side, then back at her son. "And I need you to understand something before I do. I need you to hear this clearly." She said, "I didn't know about Luca until 18 months ago." If that last line just reordered everything you thought Sylvia knew, you're exactly where this story needs you to be. Drop a comment with what you think that final condition says. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the answer is coming, and it will change everything. Sylvia spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. Ethan didn't interrupt. Nora didn't move. Even Luca, still pressed against his mother's side, seemed to sense that the room required stillness right now, and so he sat quietly, turning the watch on his wrist in slow circles the way he always did when he was thinking about something he couldn't name. The final condition, Sylvia explained, was written into Appendix C of the original agreement. The section that had been referenced but never shown to either of them until now. It was the clause Harold Calder and Robert Vance had apparently debated for months before signing, the one that had taken the longest to draft, because both men understood what it meant and neither was entirely comfortable putting it on paper. The condition was this: if either partner, or the heir of either partner, produced a child with blood from both founding families, a joint heir, the document called it, that child would automatically inherit controlling interest of the entire combined estate. Both sides. Everything. Not split between heirs. Transferred, completely, to the child. Activated on the surviving partner's heir's 40th birthday. 6 weeks from today. Ethan looked at Luca. The boy had stopped turning the watch. He was looking at the window, watching a bird on the ledge outside with the complete, absorbed attention that only small children give to ordinary things. "He's the joint heir," Ethan said. His voice came out level. He was proud of that. Sylvia said nothing. Daniel Marsh wasn't his father. It wasn't a question. He was building it in real time, piece by piece, and each piece landed with the particular weight of something that had always been true. He was placed there. By the executor. By the lawyer who drafted the original agreement, yes. Sylvia's voice was careful. "When I found out about Luca, 18 months ago, I went back through everything. Daniel Marsh's real role was to protect the child. To keep him hidden, safe, and unconnected to either family name until the legal window opened and he was old enough for the courts to protect him rather than expose him." Nora had not spoken. She was sitting very still, and Ethan could see her processing it the way she processed everything, internally, completely, the kind of thinking that happens behind the eyes rather than on the face. He turned to her. "When did you know?" he said. "About me being his father. When did you actually know?" She looked at him for a long moment. 3 months after I arrived in Geneva," she said quietly. "Sylvia's letter told me. The one she gave me the week before our wedding." She stopped. "I was already pregnant when I left. I didn't know it yet." He sat with that. She had arrived in a city she didn't know, alone, with a sealed letter and a funded apartment and instructions she didn't fully understand, and 3 months later she had opened that letter and read, in his mother's handwriting, that the child she was carrying was Ethan Calder's, and that telling him would put that child in danger from people who had been watching the Calder family for years, waiting for exactly this moment. And she had stayed silent. For 4 years. She had looked at his face in her son's face, every single day, and she had stayed silent. "Did you ever want to tell me?" he asked. She didn't look away. "Every day," she said. "I'd think about calling you. I'd think about exactly what I would say." A pause. "Then I'd look at him. And I'd decide tomorrow. Tomorrow. For 4 years. Tomorrow." Ethan stood up. He walked to the window. He stood beside his son without touching him, looking out at the same bird on the ledge, and he felt something crack open in his chest that he didn't have a category for and didn't try to name. He looked at the watch on Luca's wrist. His father's watch. The real one. Buried and somehow returned. Worn by a boy who carried blood from 2 families, 2 partnerships, 2 men who had made an agreement before either of their children existed. He looked at the watch on his own wrist. The replacement. The one he'd had made because the absence of the original had felt like a wound that needed covering. He had spent years wearing a copy of something. The real thing had been on his son's wrist the whole time. He turned around. Luca looked up at him. "Is the bird gone?" Luca asked. "Yeah," Ethan said. "It flew away." Luca nodded seriously, like that was a reasonable outcome, and went back to turning the watch on his wrist. Ethan looked at Nora. She was watching him with the expression of a woman waiting for a verdict she knows she deserves and is afraid of in equal measure. He didn't have one yet. He was still somewhere between the truth and everything it cost. His phone rang 40 minutes later. His legal director. Not his assistant, his legal director, which meant something had already happened that required a lawyer rather than a scheduler. He answered. The executor of the original partnership agreement, the man in Sylvia's photograph, the lawyer who had drafted the clause 40 years ago and placed Daniel Marsh in Geneva and watched the timeline from a distance for years, had filed a legal challenge 48 hours ago. Before Ethan had even landed at the airport. Before Nora had said 4 words in a crowded terminal. The challenge was precise. It claimed that Luca's inheritance rights under the joint heir clause could not activate without paternity being proven in a court of law, within 30 days, from the date of filing. 28 days remaining. Who's representing the executor? Ethan asked. His legal director named the firm. The most expensive in the country. 300 lawyers. A waiting list for new clients that ran 2 years long. Ethan said, who's paying for it? A pause on the line. That's what I'm calling about. Another pause, longer this time. The retainer was funded through a private account. We traced it this afternoon. It originates from inside your board of directors. The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at Nora. She didn't know what he was hearing. She could only see his face, and whatever his face was doing right now, it was enough to make her stand up. Someone on his board, someone who sat at his table, who had helped him build everything he had, who knew the inner structure of his empire better than almost anyone alive, had known about Luca before Ethan did. And they had spent 48 hours making sure 30 days was all the time he had. If you felt everything shift just now, the ground, the trust, the faces around that boardroom table, you're exactly where this story needs you. Comment who you think is sitting on that board with that secret. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the name is coming, and it will hurt. Marcus Vane. The name came back in less than 2 hours. Ethan's investigators were good at their jobs. That was why he paid them what he did. But even they sounded careful when the lead investigator called, the specific careful tone of a person delivering information they know will cause damage. The private account funding the executor's legal challenge traced through 3 shell companies before it resolved to a single holding entity. That entity had one beneficial owner on record. Marcus Vane. Co-architect of Ethan Calder's empire. The man who had been sitting across from Ethan at the head of a boardroom table for 15 years. Ethan hung up the phone. He stood in the middle of the room and said nothing for a long moment. He had known Marcus since they were both 30 years old. He had found him running a failing consulting firm with 3 clients and a gift for seeing around corners. Ethan had offered him a seat at the table when Marcus had nothing, no capital, no connections, no reason to expect it. He had trusted him with the inner architecture of everything he built. He had told him things about the company that he hadn't told his own lawyers. And Marcus had known about the joint heir clause before they ever shook hands. He told Nora everything. He sat across from her in the quiet of the living room and laid it out the way he laid everything out, clearly, completely, without softening the edges. Marcus had been hired by the executor before he ever approached Ethan. His entire role, his entire presence in Ethan's life, had been to watch. To monitor. To make sure that whatever had been set in motion in Geneva stayed invisible until the people who stood to lose everything could find a way to stop it. Nora's reappearance hadn't been coincidence. Marcus's surveillance had flagged her flight booking. He had tried to stop it and run out of time. All of it, Ethan said. Every piece of this that felt like betrayal, my mother, you, Daniel, none of it was what it looked like. It was all built around keeping Luca hidden until the law could protect him instead of expose him. Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, there's something I didn't tell you. About Daniel. He looked at her. His death wasn't heart failure. She said it steadily, the way you say something you've been carrying alone for too long. 16 months ago, a man came to Geneva. I didn't see him. Daniel dealt with it. 3 days later, Daniel was gone. She stopped. He knew what was coming. I think he knew for a long time. Ethan looked at her. Daniel Marsh, fake name, manufactured past, placed in Nora's life by a lawyer following a 40-year-old agreement, had died protecting a boy who wasn't biologically his. Had stepped between Luca and whatever came through that door, and had not walked away from it. The real story was never a betrayal. It was a protection system built by people who had no better tools, making imperfect choices in the dark, trying to keep one small child safe from men who would have used him without hesitation. Ethan understood that now. It didn't make the 11 years easier. But he understood it. Luca came in from the hallway in his socks, sliding slightly on the floor the way he always did when he thought no one was watching. He stopped near Ethan. He looked at the watch on his wrist, the way he always did, that small unconscious habit, and then he looked up. "Can I keep it?" he asked. Simply. Directly. The way children ask things when they already know what they want and are just waiting for the world to confirm it. Ethan looked at the watch. His father's watch. A 1962 Patek Philippe engraved with initials that didn't belong to this boy and somehow always had. It had traveled in ways that made no sense, through a grave and a fake diplomat and a small apartment in Geneva, and it had ended up exactly here, on the wrist of the one person who had the best claim to it. "Yes," Ethan said. He didn't hesitate. He didn't pause. "It's yours." Luca looked at the watch once more, satisfied, like a matter had been settled that was always going to be settled this way. Then he slid back down the hallway in his socks. Nora watched him go. When she looked back at Ethan, she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He called the board meeting for the following morning. He sent the notice through official channels, standard language, routine agenda, nothing in the phrasing that would signal what was actually coming. Every board member confirmed attendance within the hour. Of course they did. Routine sessions required routine attendance. No one suspected anything. He arrived early. He brought 3 people with him, his lead attorney, a notary, and a courier carrying a sealed paternity result that had been processed on an expedited basis and was now a legal document with a court stamp on the front. He also carried a removal notice. Clean. Formal. Marcus Vane's name at the top. The board members filed in. They took their usual seats. They had their usual coffee and their usual quiet conversations, and they waited for the usual rhythm of a meeting to begin. Marcus was already in the room when Ethan walked in. He was sitting in his chair, the one to Ethan's right, the one he had occupied for 15 years, the one Ethan had always thought of as the seat of his most trusted person, and he was looking at his phone. He looked up when Ethan entered. And he smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not the smile of a man about to be caught. Something slower than that. Something that had already accounted for this moment and found it manageable. Ethan set his documents on the table. Marcus set his phone face down. "I filed this morning," Marcus said. Quietly. Just to Ethan. The other board members were still settling in, still talking, still unaware. Secondary injunction. Pending resolution of the paternity dispute, all personal assets are frozen. He paused. "You have 30 days. And nothing liquid to fight with." The room filled with the sound of chairs adjusting and papers shuffling. Ethan looked at the man he had trusted completely for 15 years. He had walked in here with everything he needed to end this. And Marcus had already changed the rules of the room. 30 days. A paternity result. A frozen empire. And a 4-year-old boy at home in his socks, wearing a watch that belonged to him, completely unaware that 2 men were sitting across a boardroom table deciding what his life was worth. If you felt the ground drop out from under Ethan in that final moment, you're right where this story needs you. Drop a comment with what you think Ethan does next. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here for the last chapter, because this ending will stay with you. Ethan didn't sleep. He sat in his office through the night with one document on the desk in front of him, not the injunction, not the paternity result, not any of the papers Marcus had expected him to be scrambling over. He sat with the original partnership agreement. The one with the redacted name. The one dated 9 months before he was born. He read it the way he read every contract that mattered, slowly, looking for the thing the other side was hoping he'd miss. He found it at 2 in the morning. Buried in Appendix C, 4 lines below the joint heir clause, in language so dry it almost disappeared into the page. In matters of third-party challenge to the joint heir's claim, legal standing shall rest exclusively with the joint heir's appointed guardian of record. No external executor, trustee, or legal representative shall hold authority to override or delay said guardian's rights within the window of activation. The guardian of record. Not the executor. Not the board. Not Marcus Vane or the 300 lawyer firm he had funded in the dark. Nora. Luca's mother. The one person in this entire story who had never wanted anything except to keep her son safe. Ethan picked up the phone. His attorney took 12 minutes to read the clause and confirm what Ethan already knew. "The injunction can't hold," she said. "If Nora files as guardian of record under the original agreement, Marcus's challenge has no legal ground to stand on. The agreement supersedes the injunction because it predates the court's jurisdiction over the asset class entirely." How long to file? 24 hours. Maybe less. He called Nora next. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone absorbing the fact that after 11 years of being moved around like a piece on someone else's board, they had just been handed the one move that belonged entirely to them. "What do I have to do?" she asked. "Sign your name," he said. "That's all." Sylvia testified on the third day. She had not been asked to. Ethan's legal team had prepared their case without her, the partnership agreement, the guardian clause, the paternity documentation, all of it clean and complete. They didn't need her on the stand. She came anyway. She walked into that courtroom at 72 years old and sat down and told the truth. All of it. The arrangement she had made with Nora 11 years ago. The trust she had funded from her own accounts. The meeting she had kept from her son for over a decade. The introduction she had engineered 20 years earlier, the dinner, the seating, the carefully constructed accident that had put two people in the same room because she believed love would be easier to manage than a lawyer's negotiation. She didn't frame it as protection. She didn't soften it. She said, "I made decisions that were not mine to make. I told myself I was protecting my son. I was also protecting myself from a conversation I was afraid to have." It cost her. The foundation her name was attached to, the one she had built in Harold's memory over 15 years, would not survive the week. Board members would resign before she finished testifying. Donors would go quiet. The work she had made into her identity would come apart in real time. She knew that before she sat down. She had known it since she called her attorney the night before and told him she was going to speak. She did it without hesitation. Ethan watched from across the room. He did not look away. The ruling came down that afternoon. Luca's claim under the joint heir clause was valid. Nora's standing as guardian of record was upheld. Marcus Vane's injunction was dismissed with prejudice. The secondary challenge was thrown out entirely. And then the second part. Marcus had funded the legal challenge through accounts his own investigators could now access. Those same accounts, traced back 14 months, showed payment to a man who had traveled to Geneva 16 months ago. A man whose visit had preceded Daniel Marsh's death by 72 hours. Heart failure. That was what the death certificate said. The charges filed against Marcus Vane said something different. His assets were frozen by close of business. His seat on the board, the one Ethan had given him when he had nothing, the one he had occupied for 15 years, was removed by a vote of 8-0. The empire Marcus had helped build would now be the thing that buried him. Every record, every internal document, every system he had designed and understood would be turned over to investigators who knew exactly where to look. Ethan stood in the courthouse corridor and felt none of the things he had expected to feel. Not relief. Not anger. Not the specific satisfaction of a man who had won something that had been taken from him. He felt tired. The deep, settled tired of someone who has been carrying a question for 11 years and finally put it down, and discovered that putting it down didn't feel the way they imagined it would. Across the corridor, Nora was sitting on a bench with Luca. She was explaining something to him quietly, her head bent toward his, her voice low. Ethan couldn't hear the words from where he stood. He watched the boy's face instead. Luca was listening with his forehead slightly creased, the expression he made when he was working hard to understand something. Then he nodded. Once, seriously, the way children nod when they're trying to behave like the situation deserves. Ethan crossed the corridor. He didn't have anything prepared. He hadn't thought about what he was going to say when it was over, he had only thought about getting through it, about the documents and the clauses and the 30-day window, and now that it was over he was standing in front of a bench in a courthouse hallway with nothing except the fact of the moment. He sat down next to Luca. The boy looked at him. The watch caught the light on his wrist. "Hey," Ethan said. "What do you want for lunch?" Luca didn't hesitate. Not for a single second. "Pasta," he said. "The kind with the little ears." "Orecchiette." "Yeah." He nodded firmly, like this had been decided long before anyone asked. "That one." Nora looked at Ethan over the top of Luca's head. He looked back at her. There was no resolution in it. No clean ending. 11 years didn't close like a door, they settled, slowly, the way ground settles after something moves beneath it. They would be finding the edges of it for a long time. But the boy between them was real. His answer had been immediate and specific and completely ordinary, the way children are when the world feels safe enough to just want what they want. Ethan looked at the watch on Luca's wrist. His father's watch. His son's wrist. 3 generations carried in one small circle of gold, sitting in the light of a courthouse hallway on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and one of them, the smallest one, completely unaware of any of it, already thinking about pasta. Some things don't need a speech. Some things just need you to show up and sit down. Ethan sat down. That was where it started. Not with the ruling. Not with the documents. Here, on a bench, with a boy who knew exactly what he wanted for lunch and a watch that had finally found its way home. If this ending stayed with you, if you felt what Ethan felt sitting down on that bench, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Stories like this one exist because of people who keep coming back for them. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're here when the next one begins.